This is Dave. Dave is just starting in the world of networking. Dave is stuck at questions like: what is IP address? Different types of IP address and classes. An IP address, explained simply, is a unique number to identify the computer, user, on a network. Simply put, IP address more or less like how we humans have a name. This name helps to identify us. IP address stands for Internet Protocol. An IP address is a string of numbers separated by periods. IP addresses are expressed as a set of 4 numbers. An example address might be 192.158.1.38. Each number in the set can range from 0 to 255. So, the full IP addressing range goes from 0.0.0.0 to 255.255.255.255. An of IP in use today: IPv4 and IPv6. IPv4 addresses are 32-bit numbers that are typically displayed in dotted decimal notation. A 32-bit address contains 2 primary parts: the network prefix and the host number. The original IPv4 protocol is still used today on both the Internet and many corporate networks. However, the IPv4 protocol only allowed for 2 to the power of 32 addresses. This, coupled with how addresses were allocated, led to a situation where there would not be enough unique addresses for all devices connected to the Internet. IPv6 was developed by the Internet Engineering Task Force, IETF, and was formalized in 1998. IPv6 addresses are represented in hexadecimal format. This upgrade substantially increased the available address space and allowed for 2,128 addresses. In a Class A network, the first 8 bits, or the first dotted decimal, is the network part of the address, with the remaining part of the address being the host part of the address. There are 128 possible Class A networks ranging from 0.0.0.0 to 127.255.255.255. However, any address that begins with 127 is considered a loopback address. Example of Class A IP address is 12.20.192.3, where 12 is in network portion and rest comes under the host part. In a Class B network, the first 16 bits are the network part of the address. In dotted decimal notation, that makes 128.0.0.0 to 191.255.255.255 as Class B networks. There are 16,384 possible Class B networks. Example of Class B IP address is 150.120.3.26, where 150 and 120 are in network portion and the rest in host part. The first 24 bits of the address the network address and the remainder as the host address. Class C network addresses range from 192.0.0.0 to 223.255.255.255. There are over 2 million possible Class C networks. Example of Class C IP address is 210.120.3.26, where first 3 parts are in network portion and last octet is in host part. Class D addresses are used for multicasting applications. Unlike the previous classes, the Class D is not used for normal networking operations. Class D addresses are 32-bit network addresses, meaning that all the values within the range of 224.0.0.0 to 239.255.255.255 are used to uniquely identify multicast groups. There are no host addresses within the Class D address space, since all the hosts within a group share the group's IP address for receiver purposes. Class E addresses range from 240.0.0.0 to 255.255.255.255. While this class is reserved, its usage was never defined. As a result, most network implementations discard these addresses as illegal or undefined. The exception is 255.255.255.255, which is used as a broadcast address. Within the address space, certain networks are reserved for private networks. Packets from these networks are not routed across the public Internet. This provides a way for private networks to use internal IP addresses without interfering with other networks. The private networks are as listed here.
Consider the scenario where a web server responds to a request by sending the data to router. Web server will send data to router's public IP address, that is 20.10.10.1. Now when router receives this data, it converts its public IP to private IP, that is 10.2.2.1, which is user's IP address. So router converts public IP to private IP through a process called as NAT, Network Address Translation.